So good evening, everyone. I'm Tomas Daly. I'm a professor here at Melbourne Law School, and I'm director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network. This is the nationwide network that's hosting this event this evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the University of Melbourne for this panel on lies, law, and elections, regulating truth in political advertising. A special welcome to our moderator, Jon Faine, and to our panelists, Professor Lisa Hill, Dr. Yee-Fi Ng, and Louise Milligan. I'll introduce them in a moment, but before I do, please join me in a moment of contemplation as we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we're convening this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. On behalf of all of us assembled here, I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect and a very warm welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us this evening, both in person and online. So just to introduce our panelists, Yee-Fi Ng is an associate professor at Monash University who researches in the areas of public law and political integrity, as well as publishing widely on issues such as automated government decision-making and political advisors. She has recently written a major report on truth in political advertising, commissioned by the Susan McKinnon Foundation. Louise Milligan is a multi-award winning investigative reporter for the ABC TV Four Corners program and a best-selling author of 2 non-fiction books, Witness and Cardinal, and her first novel, Pheasant's Nest. She's a former New South Wales political reporter and a High Court correspondent as well, and her journalism largely covers social justice, the law, and politics. And finally, Lisa Hill is Professor of Politics at the University of Adelaide. She works on democratic theory, electoral studies, and the intellectual history of the Western political tradition. She's a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia, program director at the Stretton Institute for Public Policy, and research chair of the Centre for Public Integrity, an anti-corruption watchdog. So we really are delighted to have assembled such a stellar panel and to have Jon Faine as our moderator. He probably needs no introduction, but in his bio that he provided for this event, he described himself as a failed shock jock. I cannot believe he started with that. He must look so earnest. But he's also a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow here at the University of Melbourne, and it's great to have this ongoing connection with Jon. So with that background and those introductions, please let me hand over to Jon to start the panel.
Thank you, Thomas, and good evening and welcome to everyone. And I echo Thomas's acknowledgement of Australia's Indigenous history and our indebtedness to the people whose land we occupy. And on a personal note, I'll break university protocol. I've got a bit of a reputation for that, in expressing a personal disappointment at the outcome of the referendum and an impatience for those issues to be re-prosecuted, and hopefully with a different outcome. Which brings us to lies.
Yep.
It's up to you to decide the connection. But as I looked at the title, Lies, Laws and Elections, and then regulating truth in political advertising, and the first thing that struck me was that every single word in that title is contestable. Taken on its own, we could argue about what is advertising and what isn't. We can argue about what's political in an ad. We can argue, of course, about truth. We can argue about what is regulation. We can argue about what's a lie, what's a law, and where do you draw the line on when an election starts? What is the process? Where do you say, okay, now we've started the election, and so on? Every single word is loaded with meaning. And that's what words are. So my role here as VC Fellow at the university, which I occasionally describe as being part resident provocateur and court jester, is to put the contest back into ideas. And a lot of the time, a mistake that's made both by the left and the right, if those two terms still have meaning, and sometimes we wonder, We wonder whether or not we still engage in a contest of ideas, or do we just make assumptions that everyone shares a common understanding of an idea, let alone a fact. And it's increasingly clear as we look at democracies under stress all around the globe, and those that aren't even democracies or those that pretend to be democracies, we can see just how vital these conversations are. It's reassuring that you've even got a conference, and it's terrific that so many people are prepared to come along. That's a sign of good health. But I'm always reminded in my final remark before we go to our speakers, who are far better informed than me. Democracy is a fragile machine. And like any machine, and my hobby is playing with machines, if any machine isn't maintained, it breaks. If you don't do the work, you don't get the result. And we've stopped maintaining the machine of democracy. We've outsourced it. We've said it's everyone else's job. It's not our job as citizens to look after the machinery. We'll let someone else look after that, and we'll just sort of reap the benefits. It's not going to work anymore. So we'll see where that comes to. The format is very, very simple today. It's informal and it's conversational, including everyone in the room. Each of our three speakers, starting with Lisa, will be asked to deliver some provocations, maybe up to 5 minutes, which I'll then pursue with them one by one, 1, 2, 3. And I'll ask the panel then to engage on whatever points I think we've found that are either of friction or agreement. And then I'll open it up to the floor. When we get to your contributions, there's really only 1 or 2 guidelines, if you'd respect them, please.
That's one of them.
Would not interrupt, one of them. Another one would be, it's very good timing, whoever.
Yeah.
Another one would be, if you do want to introduce yourself at the start, that would be good, but it's not compulsory, but it helps people know where someone's coming from. And the only thing I'd ask you is to not ask a question of the panel. That's 3 questions. So if you could direct your question to a member of the panel, and if one of the other panelists is itching to make a contribution, then I'll allow that and invite it. But don't ask each question of 3 people, or we'll get fewer questions and less of a conversation in the round. Other than that, let's see what we come up with as we look at lies, laws, and elections. And there's no more important time for this discussion. It could not be more timely. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, John. So really, the million-dollar question is how we're going to regulate election speech, if we are at all, without damaging democracy. So how are we going to get a freedom-fairness trade-off? Michael Ignatieff, who's a political theorist and a popular commentator, once said it's in the very nature of democracy that it not only does, but should fight with one hand tied behind its back. Now, he was referring to terrorism laws. It was around the time 9/11, but I always was very struck by that's what liberal democracies do. They fight with one hand tied behind their backs because they're trying to serve lots of different values, and they're trying to protect rights as well and freedoms. So it's got a big job in its hands, but the biggest problem is fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The power to draw attention to any abuse of power, to criticise the government, is a necessary prerequisite for the operation of democratic polities because it plays a key role in preserving the public and accountability dimensions of democracy. And free speech is therefore properly regarded as a vital protection against tyranny. It's very, very important, so we must take it seriously, even as we are upset about political disinformation and misinformation. The freedom of the people to speak and exert influence over the system that governs them signifies that they are ultimately sovereign. That signifies their freedom. And in the same way that the right to vote signifies that they're sovereign. And that's a commitment that can't be abandoned by any authentic democracy, the sovereignty of the people and their right to speak. But it leaves us with a dilemma. The strength of democracy, the high value we place on freedom of expression, and the reluctance of states to over-regulate it is also its weakness. It's its strength and its weakness. It's a paradox. The conundrum then is how to manage the problem without chilling political speech, without suppressing opposition, and thereby fatally injuring democracy and the conversation culture that ensures that the people remain sovereign. That's my general observation within this debate. And the second thing I want to say, though, is I want to draw attention to a new kind or an emerging kind of disinformation that I've been tracking and that I'm finding very disturbing. We're very familiar with it in other settings, but it's creeping in here. And that is election conspiracism or election denialism, whereby it's been claimed that the election's been rigged or stolen either by private citizens or, more disturbingly, by the election authorities. And now the latter is, of course, far more damaging because it's allegedly committed by those we entrust to run our elections with integrity. At the 2022 federal election, nearly half the red flags issued by the AEC to social media platforms concerned misleading narratives about voter fraud and electoral integrity. The idea that the Commission itself was interfering in the result, or else standing by while private individuals, not doing anything, letting it happen. Among some of the conspiracy-type disinformation posted to that election was the following. The AEC is aligned to the Liberal Party. Australians who are not vaccinated will not be able to vote. Blank ballots and donkey votes are counted for the incumbent. Pencil marks are erased in the counting process. And we've seen these sort of claims made at the state level. Clive Partner, the VEC was accused of, in the 2022 election, of removing Greens and non-Labor voters from the roll, which of course it did not do. And Clive Palmer also accused the AEC of outsourcing its counting methods in the 2022 election. A lot of the time it's political leaders, not just people at the fringes, and that's why it's so damaging. And during the Voice referendum, the AEC was also a target of this kind of accusation. Media posts wrongly accusing it of rigging the vote for the yes side. And again, it wasn't just fringe actors. People like the federal opposition leader, Peter Dutton, and the Not My Voice leader, Warren Mundine, accused the AEC falsely of manipulating the referendum rules in favour of a yes vote. And this could possibly be true because it's not empowered in any way to manipulate the rules. So they're the two things I wanted to mention to get the ball rolling, John, and I think I'll stop there.
So if there's a trust deficit, that's in partnership with a civics deficit.
Mm-hmm.
The people in this room have a good understanding, I hope it's very good, about how the system works, but in fact, most Australians don't. Are you surprised that there's a trust deficit when there's such a profound civics deficit?
Am I personally surprised? First of all, it's increasingly obvious that these conspiracy theories can gain traction because Australians do not understand our complex voting system, and it is exceedingly complex. But I wouldn't change any of that complexity because what we get from that complexity is so much choice that we're really living in the land of milk and honey, but we do have a knowledge deficit about how things work. But you're also alluding to something that people don't talk about, but I'm starting to talk about because I work in other areas, political theory, and I work in antiquity as well. And this is a question of civic virtue. And you talked about this at the beginning, John. The people have sort of dropped the ball. They're not understanding that it's up to you to check the source for the information that you're relying on. It is up to you to try and work out how votes are counted. The Electoral Commission's go to a lot of trouble to educate people. They have a lot of online educational material, and we could do a lot to enhance civic virtue through proper civics education, not the sort of stuff that kids get, but actually showing kids how voting occurs, how votes are counted, and what they're getting for their votes. So one of the things I am recommending at the moment is that it be part of the SACE or HSC curriculum, that you shouldn't be able to get through high school without knowing how to cast a formal vote. Now, I'm not saying everyone should cast a formal vote. People can do what they like, but you at least should have the competency to do it. And increasingly, because we've got our informal vote rate is rising. And this is a problem. So many wasted votes. It's a competence problem. So we need to address it. But people themselves need to take some responsibility for their own democracy. It's their democracy.
there's a global trend we're seeing in a lot of first world nations, democracies, that younger people question whether democracy is actually the best way to run an economy and a society. These aren't unrelated, are they? These are very closely tied to each other, what you've just talked about, and those findings. I think in the last Japanese election, voter turnout, in fact, voter turnout in almost all elections, and this has been a super year, as you all know, voter turnout has declined almost everywhere. What's going on? No, Lisa, I'll come to you. Hold your fire.
She's got a pointy point. Yeah, it's declining. Young people seem to be turning away. Like only 40%, 42% of young people voted in the US election. Even those that are interested in politics aren't interested in what's called arena politics, which is joining parties, voting, that sort of thing. And we think some of the informal voting might be concentrated a little bit among young people. Young people prefer these non-arena activities, signing petitions, activities in the cybersphere, sort of not really realising that the big decisions are still made in parliaments. The decisions that affect their lives are made in parliament. So it's to do with what's happening in the cybersphere, I think. And a lot of young people particularly are saying that the agendas of mainstream parties don't really resonate with them. But to me, it also comes back to engagement, isolation, and responsibility. You know, one day you just wake up and you've turned into your mum, I know, but I just feel like it would be great if young people would get connected back to their political system, because young people are in really bad shape economically.
Well, we can talk about intergenerational theft if we want to, but that's a different conference. Yeah. I think that was last week. Last question for you. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here in Australia, do we? This is the same conversations are being held around the world. So are there any signs, green shoots emerging, whether it's in the Scandinavian countries or elsewhere, that make you think, well, we can learn a bit from the Finns or the South Koreans or whoever it might be?
But places doing well are places that have high turnout. And those places with high turnout have high levels of political literacy and education. Places that are doing better are also compulsory voting regimes.
There's very few of those in the world, as we know.
Correct. But, you know, the surrogate for that is the high turnout settings. But we actually have a lot of green shoots here. We're actually travelling quite well, I think partly or largely because of compulsory voting.
Well, there's only, I think, 19 countries in the world with compulsory voting and even fewer that enforce it.
Exactly, and it's very few that really enforce it. And then after that, you only want to look at the countries that are managing it properly and making sure that they've got the full voting inclusion, have the infrastructure to run it properly and the electoral management to be able to run it properly. So, and we're one of those countries, so we're actually doing a lot better than other places. We can do fight backs, what I'm saying.
Okay, so maybe everyone else is looking to us for leadership, in which case the people in this room, you're not just leaders in this country, in the world.
I can tell you a lot of Americans contact me from the Brookings Institute.
I wonder why.
100% democracy, and, you know, is desperate for help. And I think, oh man, you're really in trouble. If I'm your last hope. But really what they're doing is they're looking like 100% democracy, using Australia as the exemplar. Yeah.
Yep. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Please check your phones. It really is very, very frustrating to have phones ringing while we're going. Good. We will forge ahead. Yee-Fi, take it away.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So, good evening, everyone. One thing I should say right at the beginning is that I've flown into Melbourne at 2 a.m. from Europe. So if I am coherent for the next 1.5 hours, it will be one of the greatest achievements of my life. So I'm hoping for coherence and hopefully the outcome will be achieved. So I thought I'll spend my time talking about the Truth in Political Advertising law project that I've been doing with the Susan McKinnon Foundation and the findings from that. So what I did was I interviewed 31 former premiers, ministers, MPs, electoral commissioners, and the party officials as well, the state secretaries and the party directors, mostly in South Australia, and some from other jurisdictions. So just an overview of the landscape, first of all. So we do have truth in political advertising laws in South Australia that have been in operation for 39 years. And the ACT also has truth in political advertising laws introduced in 2000. And they've had their very first election using those laws in October. So still very new in the ACT. And at the Commonwealth level, they've introduced a bill on truth in political advertising in the House of Representatives. As to whether it will be passed, big question mark, and looking increasingly shaky and quite unlikely at this point. But there is some experience that we already have in Australia in the operation of these laws. And I'll talk about how they've operated in South Australia, where they've been in place for so many years. So first of all, what can such a law look like? What does a truth in political advertising law look like? And this is an unprecedented law. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. We've looked at the other countries, and they do regulate transparency. They do regulate deepfakes and AI-generated images and things like that. But we are actually one of the first to introduce such laws. And the truth in political advertising laws, what they do. So they are very narrow. They're limited to statements of fact that can be proven to be verifiably false. And that means it doesn't cover predictions and opinions. So, the Liberals are good economic managers. That's an opinion that will not be covered by the laws. So you can see that only the most egregious lies would be covered by these laws. And currently, these laws are administered by the electoral commissioners. And I must say they are doing a great job in administering the laws. Shout out to the electoral commissioners in the room and their staff. It is an invidious task to administer such a law because all the political parties are screaming at them. It's an electoral campaign where everyone is stressed. The timeframes are very short. So administering such a law is really an invidious task, and they've done a marvelous job in doing so. So that's one thing I should say. And another thing is that I think it's important for the laws to be broad enough to cover the various political actors. So it has to cover not just the political parties, but associated entities and third-party campaigners as well. Otherwise, you can just channel the lies through a different body. Another thing to say is that the way that we communicate has changed dramatically over the last decades. So if you look at the reports from even 2000, 2001, the main medium of broadcast was television and the radio. And now we've got social media basically overtaking everything else. So such a law has to cover Twitter, Facebook, or X, Meta, whatever they call them these days. And social media definitely has to be covered. The way that we've seen the laws operate is the political parties in South Australia have completely changed the face of their electoral campaigning. They pore over the words of each of their ads to make sure they are accurate. So it has changed the practices of political parties. In the last couple of elections, we've seen it used a bit more as a political tool. So they just sort of fling complaints at each other. And they try to stymie the other side a little bit with their complaints. But this kind of gaming has happened for various types of laws, like anti-corruption commissions and vexatious referrals and things like that. And basically, the South Australian participants show a strong support for the laws. They've been in place a long time. They're well accepted. They are run very well. And the political parties accept the the recommendations of the Electoral Commission. And basically, there is respect for the law. It does work well. And so that's a proof of a system that does work and does work pretty effectively. And in the ACT, I've spoken to a few people so far, and it's still in its infancy. So there were very few complaints, and yeah, the parties are aware of it, and they're starting to come to grips with it, and that seems to be operating quite well. And the ACT participants say that it's quite a polite political culture anyway, not like some other jurisdictions, which they did not name. Okay, they did say the federal level. So there's a question as to whether the laws that have operated in small jurisdictions where, there's less vicious political behavior would be transplanted well in bigger jurisdictions and be able to be administered as quickly. So the Electoral Commissioner has been quite timely in South Australia in adjudicating the claims. I guess these are a few of the findings of what I've looked at, and happy to discuss further.
If the South Australian laws have been such a success, and as you've remarked, they've been there for a long time, how come they haven't been adopted elsewhere?
That's what the South Australians kept asking me. It's like, why? We're so awesome. We've done this, political incubation. It's worked so well. And there have been debates, actually, like the Victorian Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters has recommended that these laws be considered. There's some talk about it in the New South Wales Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. And we've seen the Commonwealth have attempts to put up a bill. I mean, they have put up a bill, but I'm not sure they'll be passed. So there is interest, and interesting interest in this area, I think.
But I guess I'm trying to unpick the political reality rather than the administrative reality. There's been no appetite for this sort of reform outside of South Australia. Do you want to wonder why, or did you, from your interviews, get any insights into why?
Well, I've talked to people from Victoria and New South Wales. Some people think, oh, such laws are not going to be effective anyway. Such laws are not necessary. We try to tell the truth anyway in our political ads. We, like the internal party.
Who told you that?
Unnamed sources. But the thing is, political campaigning is not just about selling a positive message. What they found is that the negative ads are the ones that are the most effective, those that attack people and are emotional, like draw on the emotional response. So in every political campaign, there will be that negative attack and emotion-driven campaigning. And some of that might not be truthful. So you're quite right, there is an issue here. And we've seen, the US elections and gotten all dismayed. And we can fear that such a trend may come to Australia, this kind of lies, fake news, alternate facts that can be easily transposed to any democracy. And it has happened in the US. So we do have to be worried and think about how we should regulate this.
I'll come to the administration of the laws in a moment, but still talking about the people who brought them in. Given that it's about power, and everything we're talking about is about power, what were the different responses from people who have got power to people who have lost power? Did they have the same regard for the administration of those laws when they lost power as they had when they gained power?
In South Australia, you mean? I think that both political parties, all the politicians I've spoken to supported the laws, and both sides of the fence as well. One thing I should say about these kinds of laws or any real laws about political integrity it's against the politicians' interest to bring them in. It regulates them, it shackles them. So any legislation of that sort takes a very big push, like the National Anti-Corruption Commission, that took years of campaigning. It's really against their interest to bring in laws that will scrutinize them. And that's why getting these kinds of laws passed is a very big uphill battle.
Was the response in your interviews from the bureaucrats who administer the laws markedly different from the responses from the politicians who seek to, as you said, game the laws?
The electoral commissioners and the deputy electoral commissioners are all, neutral, impartial, but broadly supportive of the laws. So they're like, you've given us this job to do, and we will do it to the best of abilities. We'll need sufficient resourcing to do the laws, to administer the laws, because it's at the busiest period. So they do need to be resourced to perform their roles. But I think they see themselves as being neutral, impartial, which is why they are so widely respected. So they say, if you give us this task of administering the laws, we will do it to our best of our capacity, and hopefully they'll get enough resourcing to do so.
And forgive my ignorance, I should have researched this, but has there been any litigation about the South Australian laws?
So the electoral commissioner can take political parties to the courts for really big lies. And there have been different appetites for prosecution over the 39 years. Some commissioners are quite keen to prosecute. In more recent times, there's fewer prosecutions. It depends on the way that the commission operates and the commissioner's priorities. But one thing I should say is that the most effective remedy is the withdrawal and retractions process, because when they have to withdraw or retract, they have to do it in the same avenue where it's posted. So if it's a Facebook or Meta post, they have to post the retraction in the form determined by electoral commissioner in that same forum. So the same audience will get access to that. And as soon as the electoral commissioner makes a finding against one of the political parties, the other one will go to the media and go, look, this party has lied. And then there's the media embarrassment is the biggest cost to them. So it isn't so much going to the courts or getting a small fine. It's the embarrassment of being caught to have lied.
And how timely is that process? Take us through how quickly a corrective measure can be enforced and adopted.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the electoral commissioner has said some complaints are a lot more complex than the others, but generally the closer it is to the election, the quicker they require a response. So if it's the week of the election, they might require a response the next day. And yeah, the problem is if the parties try to lengthen the process by bringing in lawyers and things like that. So that might lengthen the process. But in general, they have been able to resolve complaints quite expeditiously, although some of the parties will complain it wasn't quick enough. I think in general, they've done a pretty good job given the circumstances.
So an ad is published, a complaint is lodged.
Yep.
The complaint is processed.
It's investigated.
It's investigated. The parties are allowed to make submissions on the investigation. A result is posted.
Yep.
Can that then be contested? Is there an appellate process as well?
Not in the short time frame. Normally, if it's a few days before the election, that's too late. And that's what the ACT people have complained about. They said, we don't have a mechanism of contesting the electoral commissioner's rulings. And that might be something that could be reformed in a future law. But that, again, will drag out the process. So it's that balance between getting a quick result, but also giving the parties procedural fairness and opportunities to respond.
Yeah, and you can, in fact, see coming a mile away if you were to go down the path of the federal bill that is at the moment parked. There are so many red flags there for litigation, but let's not get distracted by that. And just final question before we come to Louise. I asked Lisa before about overseas examples. Do we need to reinvent the wheel? So South Australia has for decades had this law, but are there other jurisdictions we should look to for inspiration as well?
For the European Union has quite sophisticated legislation in everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of things. And this includes the Digital Services Act, which looks to regulate the social media platforms with quite significant penalties, because truth in political advertising is a very tiny slice of the pie. It's the actual political ads released by people seeking to influence an election. But what about all the other disinformation that's out there? So I think to regulate disinformation more broadly, we kind of need to look beyond truth in political advertising laws and to seek to regulate the social media platforms as well. And the EU does provide some model for that.
Because we're a bit of an outlier. It's mostly democracies that are under threat, like Finland, Estonia, Taiwan, South Korea, that are leading the charge on dealing with lies in social media in political processes. Fascinating that they are the ones feeling that they are facing existential threats and they're leading the global charge on all of these things.
Yeah, I guess the EU has been a leader in regulating a lot of fields. Like they have the best data protection laws with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the AI Act regulating AI and so forth. So they have been leading the charge for quite a long time in this kind of regulatory space. So I'm not surprised that they are also leading in trying to regulate in the digital media space.
Although that's another conference yet again. We've spawned, I think we've spawned 3 conferences already. We haven't even heard from our third speaker yet. Louise, please.
I feel like I'm the non-learned person on this panel. I did do a law degree, but I think I was the naughtiest girl in the school. But anyway, I guess coming at this from a journalistic perspective, and I wanted to sort of like share some of the things that I've done in my research for Four Corners. First of all, I was going to say, apart from the lack of civics education per se, I think also declining rates of literacy and rates of reading of young people it is really important. I mean, it's interesting. There's a really interesting book by a woman called Marianne Wolfe called Reader Come Home, which is about this very topic. And she quotes Barack Obama talking about how everything that he learned about empathy, he learned from novels. So it's actually not just learning about civics, it's actually just reading per se, I think, is declining. And for Four Corners, we did a story on literacy where we went to schools around the country and we interviewed, teenagers. And, there were lots of kids that we spoke to who said, none of my friends read books at all. And I think that that's a real problem. And, that idea of empathy really goes into politics and trust, and listening to other people's perspective and thinking about whether, for instance, the Electoral Commission is trustworthy and so on. So I think that's one thing. I spoke to Dee Madigan, who makes ads. She makes political ads. And with respect to our friends, the South Australians, who are lovely and very earnest people, she thinks that those laws are, in her words, a bloody wet lettuce. And she thinks that not particularly sort of successful. And she also thinks that the real space that we should be looking at is the unregulated space, which is, as you say, social media. And she says because the advertisers who advertise on free-to-air television And all of the ads they make, while they might not actually be on free-to-air television, you want the option of it being on free-to-air television. So they have to comply with what's called CAD, which is Commercial Advice Division of Free TV Australia. So they have to actually be able to substantiate what they're saying. Whereas she's like, on social media, you can say whatever you like. And I mean, I think really good examples of that came in the US election. So we travelled to the United States to speak to social media insiders for our recent program, Disconnected, on social media for Four Corners. And Eddie Perez, who was in the Trust and Safety Division at Twitter before it became X, before it became even more of a bin fire or a complete bin fire, he was talking about the examples in the US election where, okay, it's not technically advertising, but this is a platform that is owned by Elon Musk, and Elon Musk is donating to Trump's campaign, and Elon Musk is posting stuff that is unreconstructed disinformation. So a really good example is we're eating the cats, we're eating the dog, or they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, which was, of course, this completely discredited claim that Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating pets. Now, the thing about that was it was something that started off on social media. It was elevated very significantly by Elon Musk. He was posting the memes, etc. And then Donald Trump repeats it in the election debate. And so it takes on a life of its own. Now, people were sort of joking about this and, as I say, there were all the sort of funny memes and so on. But this had real life consequences for these poor Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio. They were receiving death threats. There were sort of white supremacists who were marching and so on. And so I feel like those sorts of things in today's climate, particularly where there are declining, sadly, numbers of people who are watching news services and programs like ours, but they are getting their information from places like X, from podcasts, etc. I think that these broader definitions of political advertising are really important. And I should say, I don't know if I said this at the start, but Jon will be familiar with this disclaimer. Of course, I say all of this on my own behalf. I don't speak for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation.
Doesn't work retrospectively. No.
Anyway, but this is, I'm saying this as a product of journalism, of people that I've spoken to for our program who have a lot of experience in this. So I think that that's really interesting. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was some of the murkier stuff that I've personally experienced around bot farms, for instance. Now, I experienced it in relation to some journalism I did on George Pell. So I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone who George Pell was. I wrote a book about him. It was based on journalism that I had done for the ABC TV 7:30 program. It came out, it was called Cardinal. It came out 6 weeks before George Pell was charged with multiple offences historical against children. And we all know how that all ended up in the High Court, that he was ultimately acquitted after being convicted by a jury and that being upheld by the Court of Appeal. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that as a result of that, I was targeted by bot farms. And they were very clearly bot farms because they were people, for instance, who had no followers and a whole lot of numbers after their name and were supposed to be based in Canada and yet had really intricate understandings of ABC funding. I mean, like, how fascinating. over there in Toronto that you're thinking about these questions. But it was always the same voice, but coming from all these different places. And I would be absolutely bombarded with these things. Now, this is happening in the political space as well. And Dee Madigan actually raised this as well in relation to vaping. She was targeted in that debate. The point is that when I discovered that I was being targeted by these bot farms, I happened to be contacted by a whistleblower who was familiar with, he said, who was actually paying for these things. Now, I'm not going to go into it because I'm not going to defame anyone, but this person was a very wealthy person who was, you know, connected to the church and connected to people in politics and so on, and was apparently paying for bot farms, not just against me. I mean, I was just one of the things that he was doing, but others as well. And now this is a really nefarious way of getting a message out, and there's no way of kind of tracking it because no one is admitting that they are doing it, but it is a form of advertising. It's a way of getting a message out, making it look like more people share that view, really, really targeting an opponent. And this was definitely happening before the last election. So I think they're really important issues. I mean, the bot farms, I think X is now getting to the point where it's almost like exploding in flames. Like, I don't know how much mainstream value it's going to continue to have. A lot of people are retreating from it. But, you know, there are lots of different social media platforms. You see, you know, these sorts of things happening across them. And I think, you know, certainly for young people, this is where the rubber hits the road as far as political advertising is concerned.
So maybe we're all on the wrong tram.
Yeah.
The world has changed.
Yeah.
And there's no point howling at the moon and going, tut, tut, tut. Isn't that terrible? In fact, what we have to learn is how to keep up with even the bad actors if we want to protect democracy, and we have to play the same game, do we not?
Well, that's really interesting because we've seen what's just happened with the mis and disinformation bill in Australia. And also when I was travelling in the US, when we were in Washington, I interviewed Nina Jankovic, who was the very ill-fated disinformation commissioner in the United States, appointed by Joe Biden. She was in that position for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, because she got absolutely slammed by a very, very targeted campaign.
Are we surprised?
No, but I mean, it's still, it was pretty bad for Nina. Like, she was being doxxed. She was having to have security out the front of her house 24/7.
This is like the mafia. I mean, this is the information mafia. You are dealing with people, we talked about power before, you are dealing with people who have everything to lose and they will stop at nothing to protect what they've got.
Well, that's, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty extreme way of putting it, but perhaps, you know, that's maybe where we are. I mean, certainly for her, you know, she basically quit. She was pregnant, you know, she was worried for her unborn child. But the point is, this was an attempt to address this sort of thing from happening. I mean, it was really interesting.
You don't fight a bushfire with a garden hose.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on how you actually do fight this stuff, but it's interesting that attempts to fight it have been really shot down in flames. And it was interesting, like, just I was sort of saying to Dee, let's talk about some of the old hits and memories of the old days when political advertising was actually a thing. And I was looking at the Democrats ad, and there's Cheryl Kerno looking all lovely and quaint and whatever, and it's keep the bastards honest. And I thought, like, wow, like, it's such a simple kind of message, and so effective. And of course, Barack Obama, yes, we can. You know, Gough Whitlam, it's time. But Dee was saying to me, they just wouldn't work anymore. Like,
sure. A lie's gone round the world before the truth's got out of bed, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that, and now I'll open it up to all three of you, it would seem to me that there's a whole bunch of people, both politicians and bureaucrats, administrators, people in the legacy, and I'll call it legacy media, who think that everything should go nicely how it used to. Those were the rules and that's how we should do it. And they haven't noticed that the world's actually moved along.
Well, I think they have. I mean, I feel like they have noticed that the world's moved along.
Well, the chairman of the ABC hasn't noticed that Joe Rogan's got 3 million people listening to his podcast every week.
Look,
And that's power, as opposed to, I don't know how many people watch Four Corners. I'm sure it's fabulous, but it's not 3 million people a week.
I'm not going to comment on what the chairman of the ABC said.
No, but I can.
Swing for the fences, John. But the point is, I do think, I don't think that he's not aware of that. But the thing is, we have a charter, as you know, because you worked there for so many years, to actually get things right.
Yeah, yeah.
Joe Rogan can say whatever he likes.
Yeah, yeah.
And it doesn't matter. And so, you know, I don't think the two are comparable.
So that's the conference about the future of the ABC. That's number 4 that we've identified.
Yeah, it's not what we're talking about today, yeah.
But let's open it up. Lisa, do you think the world has changed and we haven't adapted as these things have moved along?
It's too hard to adapt. The technology of creating lies is moving faster than the technology to track it.
Yep.
But I want to go back to this point about the difference between having millions of followers and who watches Four Corners. There will be lies. There will be people that say anything. We need a show like this, which is a still point of truth and accuracy. And it doesn't matter how many people are watching it. It has to be there in case someone wants to check into the facts.
Yes, it does.
And
Absolutely, it does.
It has to be there as a symbol and as a model. But when you talk about we're on the wrong train with just truth in political advertising versus the bigger problem, we all know that that's the bigger problem. But we're not on the wrong train. They're two different trains. And, they say the fish rots from the head. I personally think it rots. In the classical conception of corruption, it rots from the tail up, actually. But a lot of the problem started when a certain politician just started to say anything. And then after a while, people became very climatised very fast to not only believing lies, but not even caring if it wasn't true. So we're not on the wrong train with trying to target authorised speech, disinformation by political actors, because they lead the norms. They are our leaders. We need some sort of symbol, and we need an exemplar that evinces civility. And so I think they're two different trains. That's why they're in separate bills. It wasn't packaged up. The Electoral Communications Bill wasn't packaged up with the mis and disinformation bill. It was put separately because they're different trains, and we need to get on both of them. But a good place to start is with this very conservative, narrow legislation, because it's a good way of showing it's feasible. The sky doesn't fall down when you constrain a bit of speech. There's still plenty of speech around, but it would be very nice if somebody set an example, and that should be our leaders. So I agree. I think we're in real trouble. We are in real trouble about how to handle mis and disinformation. But this is a start, and it's a feasible start. It's completely doable, and I don't think it's like a piece of wet lettuce at all. I live in South Australia, and believe me, it's so relaxing sitting as a political scientist, sitting through a state election. I don't have to, when I go to my letterbox and find, and by the way, politicians exempt themselves from the Junk Mail Act, the Spam Act, the Privacy Act, the Do Not Call Register. So this stuff is coming in. But at the state elections, this isn't coming in. And that's relaxing, that's refreshing. And it's nice to see people behaving themselves.
It is a nice place, South Australia.
Yeah,
Our good people.
I'm not from South Australia originally, so I'm not being patriotic. I'm just saying it's not nothing. It's not nothing.
I mean, and I should say that that's Dee's opinion, because I don't have enough of the knowledge to know that. But I just thought it was interesting to hear from an
that's the fifth
advertiser.
conference about Australia's culture.
yeah.
Yee-Fi, what did the Susan McKinnon Foundation want to achieve by funding your research, and what's the purpose of it? What's the outcome they're looking for?
Well, basically, they wanted to achieve law reform, as do I. So it's trying to enhance the political debate, enhance our understanding of how these laws actually operate in practice and whether they are effective. And my final report will also propose recommendations for reform and say what's a desirable scheme in the end.
And how far away is that?
They're very strict on me. They've cracked the whip and say I have to submit by this Friday. And then
You've just got jet lag.
I know, right? But it's okay. I will persevere, and
Oh, so it's imminent.
it's imminent. Yeah, so it should be released in December.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, next couple of weeks.
It's Christmas present for democracy. That's fabulous.
John, can I just say that there's another book that I wrote with a couple of my proteges, and Max Douglas, he's up the back there. We wrote a book about the same laws, and we've put some recommendations in there, and they've turned up in that federal legislation. There's lots of people interested in this, but I was very excited when I knew that Yee-Fi was working on this project, because we didn't really know. It was really to test whether it's chilling speech and hurting democracy, and that's what that was my understanding, if that's what you were checking for.
Yeah, so it was unanimous that there was no chilling of free speech at all, because those laws are constructed very narrowly. They're just statements of fact. And it was also unanimous that the South Australian Electoral Commissioner's reputation for impartiality was completely untarnished. So everyone still believed that they are impartial and they still have faith in the Electoral Commission.
Okay, which is remarkable. We're about to go to questions, and I'll keep a running list as I see hands come up. We've got a roving mic here and a roving mic on the other aisle, and I'll take your questions in the order that I see them. And I'll just remind you, if you can say who you are, you don't have to, but if you want to, that would be great, and ask a question of an individual. And if you want to recite a poem or sing a song or make a speech or something like that, that's fine after 7:30, but before 7:30, we're just taking questions from the floor as well. Just last question, and I can ask a question of you, each of you. We are in an era that's been evolving now since Silvio Berlusconi of performative politics. Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, I could keep on going across not just the Anglosphere, but right across all the democracies. Wherever you go now, you see people who are taking their cue from a remarkable political performer. Whether you love him or hate him, Donald Trump is a phenomenal product of America. You know, P.T. Barnum and Bailey, circus people, you'll never go broke underestimating the intelligence of the people. And here's a guy who's combined showbiz and politics with a strategy that has just remarkably worked. Are our laws in Australia fit for purpose when someone tries that here? Louise.
I don't think I'm the best person to ask about whether our laws are fit for purpose, because I think there are people here who are experts about that. But I do also think that in Australia, we haven't really entered that kind of era to the same extent.
But it will come.
Well, maybe. I mean, I think our politicians are often quite, they're not showmen and women. They're actually quite, by international standards, you know, quite serious. One might think quite boring, you know, like, and I'm kind of happy with boring, really.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was thinking about this panel tonight, I was remembering, so when I was a state political reporter in New South Wales, it was in what I like to call the Obeid years. We had 4 premiers in 5 years, from Carr to Keneally. And in the middle of that was the 2007 election where Morris Yema won. He had been and speaking of like Morris, bless his cotton socks, was not a showman. And he had an election campaign, and his slogan was, it's just the most boring slogan of all time. More to do, but we're heading in the right direction. and I was like, oh, they were simpler times. And he won.
Yeah.
There was a small matter of the opposition leader was not really up to scratch, but yeah, I don't imagine that something like that would work now. But I don't think we have entered, like, touch Laminex. I don't think we have entered that era yet in Australia. Maybe it's not coming.
We're seeing little elements of it. For example, with the election conspiracies, and you do see people being identified online, harassed, election workers being harassed. In America, they're being shot at, threatened. 25% have resigned there because they're frightened to be election officials. We're seeing touches of that here, but not to the same degree. Something that's kind of insulating us from going that direction is, believe it or not, people in compulsory voting regimes are more politically sophisticated than people in non-compulsory regimes. So Australians are actually more sophisticated than audiences in a lot of other places.
So you think that's preventative?
That's insulating us. And also the other thing that's insulating us is we have these highly trusted electoral commissioners, and they're the most trusted public servants still. It's starting to put a dent. The conspiracism and the lies are putting a dent, but still reputation means a lot, and the reputation precedes them. So we're insulated by a few things, but compulsory voting is really insulating us in a very cosy, comfortable way, in lots of ways that people underestimate. For example, it insulates you against corruption.
Yep.
And we don't even know why, but I've got a few theories. We don't even know why, but it's our little comforter that's protecting us from a lot of this nastiness.
Yee-Fi?
Yeah, I agree with Lisa and Louise that the last show pony politician I can think of was Paul Keating, and that's a long time ago now.
Jeff Kennett.
Okay.
Yeah,
fine.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
state level. So I don't think we have reached that stage where it's all about show ponying in the political world. But that being said, there is increasingly across all Western democracies what the couple of political scientists call the presidentialization of politics. So that's the resources centered on the prime minister or premier, media being funneled through there, and centralization in general. And I agree that our system is protecting us, that system of compulsory voting, the very strong and independent electoral commissions that we have, that prevents all these things that we see in the US of gerrymandering and sort of tampering with the elections. As to whether the laws are fit for purpose, I think laws do need to be reconsidered and updated over time. So if, like the truth in political advertising laws were put in 1985, where you might have like, I don't know, a couple of phone booths or something, the state of technology was very different then and it has evolved over time where at one point, the newspaper, the broadsheets were the major form of communication, and then television and talkback radio, and now it's the social media. So I think we do need to monitor over time how the laws are working. And because the truth in political advertising laws in South Australia were drafted broadly without talking about the method of communication, it's the commissioner has been applying it to social media posts, which I think is necessary. But yeah, I think we can't be complacent with what we have. We're seeing a troubling phenomenon of disinformation and misinformation spreading globally. And we need to make sure our laws and institutions remain strong to protect against that.
Okay, questions, and I'm looking for hands. They're popping up everywhere. I know Michael's first up, and I'll grab a few more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll work our way through. Thank you.
Thanks, Jon. Michael Maley from Electoral Regulation Research Network in the ACT, and I might add, author of the drafting instructions for the last truth in advertising provisions that were in the Commonwealth Electoral Act briefly 40 years ago. I want to pick up the point that Lisa made about provisions being narrow and focused, and I'm particularly looking at the bill that was introduced in the House of Reps a week or so ago, which talks about proscribing written statements purporting to be a statement of fact which are inaccurate or misleading in a material extent. And that in some ways strikes me as not as narrow and precise as the formulations which talk about things being true or false. And I'd like to give you an example of this. One of the things we see in election campaigns all the time now is trawling of the other side's social media statements from their dim, distant past with the aim of finding something really stupid or bigoted that someone has said. And the typical response of the candidate these days is to say, that's not who I am now. I have abandoned that thought, rhubarb, the usual sort of excuses. If I quote the first statement they made without making, and I quote it accurately, without quoting their disavowal of it, is that misleading? Now, they would no doubt say yes, that it is representing me as something which I claim I'm not. The counter argument is Maya Angelou's proposition: when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. So in those sorts of circumstances, is this really as narrow as one would like it to be? Or are there in fact going to be grey areas in here, which I suspect will be the case, which then become a death trap for the regulators?
So it's not about material extent. That's not what you're concerned about. You're concerned about a person having said something that they no longer subscribe to quite a long time ago. The TV laws tend not to be investigated for anything that's too far. I think the furthest down the track that Mick's ever investigated something was 2 years previous. So they will tend not to be interested in that. They'll be more interested in the more recent thing, is my understanding. Because I can see what you're saying, that could create problems. The two statements are correct, and yet they contradict each other, but you only have to abstract one of them and still be on safe ground, except that if there's more than sort of 2 years between the statements, then the Commissioner wouldn't investigate it. There will be grey areas.
There will be an evolving jurisprudence on this, as there has been on corruption, as there has been on whatever else is introduced. It'll go to the courts, it'll be tested, the courts will decide, someone may appeal to a higher court, a ruling will be made, an interpretation will be made, and that'll set out the groundwork.
That's right. But what happens is that the Commissioner doesn't just go and look at it. The Commissioner, if they looks at it, thinks, this is a bit iffy. Then the Commissioner refers it in South Australia to the Crown Solicitor's Office. Now, the Crown Solicitor's Office are very good at determining matters of fact. That's their job. So people will say, oh, what is a fact and what is the truth? That's what the law does all the time. And so they're not just making that call on their own either.
Okay.
Part of the problem in the Commonwealth thing is they've got to do it within 2 days, which doesn't give them
it's 24 hours,
that sort of legal advice.
Thanks, Michael. Up in the middle there, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I work for the New South Wales Electoral Commission in the customer service space. Yee-Fi, I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, how effective are the regulations when often once a lie is in the public arena, it can pervade public consciousness and become quote unquote fact to certain groups, like, for example, Louise's example of the Haitian migrants. Is some effort to regulate enough of a deterrent, even if not totally effective, to balance the control of mis or disinformation and the protection of freedom of political expression?
And that was a question to who?
Yee-Fi.
To Yee-Fi, thank you.
Sure. So any regulation of truth or political speech has to balance competing considerations. So we do have the implied freedom of political communication protected by the Australian Constitution. But we also don't want lies spreading, and the spreading of lies undermines our democracy because it misleads voters and changes their preferences. So to achieve that balance, a law that's narrow, like we talked about before, confined to statements of fact, and retractions and withdrawal process in the same forum in which the misleading or deceptive or lie is posted, I think is pretty effective, because what the Americans will say, and the Americans can't regulate in this area because of their constitution, what they say is we combat lies or bad speech with more speech. But that belies the reality that some people have a bigger megaphone or bigger voice than others. So if you're a lone person trying to get your message heard versus, you know, influential influencer with millions of followers, your voice is not the same. Whereas if you have a retractions and withdrawal process in the same forum, that equalizes it. So I think there is scope for regulation, and we already regulate speech. We have defamation laws. So it's not like it's a completely unregulated space. There's things that we do want to restrict, like people defaming other people's reputation or blatant lies that are spread in an election context.
Blackmail, there are millions of laws.
Yeah.
that
Free speech, no such thing as free speech. It's a
No,
nonsense.
no, and most of us would agree with those restrictions that I shouldn't be threatened. There shouldn't be a discriminatory job ad, and the sky doesn't fall in. We think that makes the society better, and it creates protections, particularly for minorities.
But we are seeing in it, one of the other things that's evolving, in particular in America, are these free speech absolutists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we don't have, I mean, the things that regulate speech in Australia, there's a huge list. You know, discrimination laws, contempt, all sorts
Conspiracy.
of stuff, all sorts of stuff is regulated. False advertising, you know, just in commercial advertising, election advertising. So, but you're now getting people, and Elon Musk is the most high profile, but by no means the only one, saying all of those should be disappeared. What do you do in the face of that sort of thinking?
But this goes to your question that you were raising at the beginning when you were saying, John, all the terms here are contestable. And I think we really need to think long and hard what we mean by speech. What do we mean by speech? And what are speech freedoms designed to protect? Are speech freedoms designed to protect lies? And what is free speech for? It's so we can live together, communicate together, self-govern together, keep governments accountable. All the functions for which speech really is supposed to perform, lies don't fit in there anywhere. They don't fit in there anywhere. For example, the US Supreme Court has deemed speech producing child pornography so long as it's computer generated. They call that speech. There's another one called the Stolen Valor Act that Max wrote about, where this guy was going around saying he won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And the local RSL kicked up and the Supreme Court told him to cut it out. He took it to the Supreme Court. They struck down the local courts and said he had a right to go around saying that. Now, I cannot...
No, it's not true. It's demonstrable.
It's not true. He just bought them from a shop and goes around saying he won it. So this is a kind of debate of people having about free speech. But here, we're all sitting here going, are you for real, Lisa? Are you making these examples up? I'm really not. Because, and what's weird about them is free speech, as we know it in democracy, was never meant to protect that kind of communication. It doesn't perform any function of any use in a democracy. It doesn't help anyone to be able to say you won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and it's a great insult to the people that did win it. And it certainly doesn't help anyone to say that child pornography is speech. Here's the thought experiment I always think of. Say you knew that everybody lies, 50% of the population lies all the time, and 50% doesn't. Okay, so there's a lot of lies. There are a lot of lies awash in the culture. You don't know who the liars are and who aren't. Pretty soon, wouldn't you stop bothering to listen to what anyone said?
50-50.
Yeah. I would stop because it's too exhausting for me to work it out. And pretty soon I'd stop speaking as well, because people weren't listening, and I'd know that people were constantly doubting anything I said. So in a world awash with lies, it's just such a polluted environment. It's not speech anymore, it's something else, but it's not a free speech environment.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman here.
Andy Prokop, in the age of social media and disinformation, do you feel we're going to be eating dogs by the next election, or is this an aberration of American politics?
And who's that for? Who do you want to direct that question to?
Louise Milligan.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of it.
In the age of social media and disinformation, are we going to be eating dogs by the next election?
Oh, are we going to get to that stage? I think, you know, I don't think we're at that stage here, but I definitely think that there is a lot of disinformation floating around. And it's really interesting because we've got these like two parallel things happening. I mean, there was just a reference by Lisa to defamation law, and I think Yee-Fi said it as well. Like, our defamation laws in this country, I'm here to tell you, the struggle is real. Like, they are incredibly difficult and have profound consequences for my practice every day. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, Australia, like, we accept that. There's no one marching in the street for defamation law reform. But then on the other side of the ledger, you know, when the Parliament tries to bring in mis and disinformation laws, there are all these sort of like attacks on that. So, yeah, I
think Bruce Lehman and Ben Roberts-Smith would lead the march for defamation law reform.
Well, no, but not on the side that I'm talking about, which is, I mean, which is on the side of
opening it up.
Well, yeah, but also on the side of carefully fact-checked forensic journalism. Call it legacy media. I call it seeking the truth, right? So, and it's really important, as you said. We need to protect that. But I don't think we don't have the demagogues yet, you know, in this country, like the Trumps and some of those other international characters. And I hope that, you know, that we're not going to get to that stage of a prime ministerial candidate in a debate on television actually just spouting complete disinformation. But, you know, you have to keep being vigilant about this stuff.
We're trying to avoid making those.
But I honestly don't believe that it's about right and left.
No, you can
because
get a
it happens on both sides.
And a populist on the left as well, exactly.
Yeah.
But not just a populist on the left. You can get people on the left of politics who are sort of, you know, for instance, saying, oh, well, you can't believe things in the mainstream media, and then putting up alternate facts. You get that on the right as well.
Yep.
Like, no one has the sort of moral high ground on this, except for people who are carefully, forensically fact-checking information before it is published or broadcast. And of course, I would say this, but we belong in that category at Four Corners.
You do.
You get Pauline Hanson and Lydia Thorpe, and they are an expression of the same approach to politics. If you strip away the labels that you attach, is, I think, well, I'll make that comment. And I think it tells us something about the way politics is being practiced in Australia, and we may see more of that. I will not be surprised as the two parties, the major parties, are losing their monopoly, and most football clubs have more members than our political parties these days, just to remind you. And a former colleague of mine on the radio, someone who used to be on my show a lot, who was a Conservative politician, said every time he goes to a branch meeting in his electorate, and he's in his 40s, he walks in and the average age collapses just by him walking in the door. Most members are septuagenarians or octogenarians. Now, I have a list of people, but I'm trying to avoid going from pale stale male to pale stale male to pale stale male. So I'm juggling the list to include people who aren't pale stale males. And if there are more people who want to ask questions who aren't pale stale males, I will similarly give you priority. Andrea Carson.
Thanks. Oh, wow, that is loud. For those who may not have heard, I'm Andrea Carson, a Professor of Political Communication at La Trobe University, and well done to the panel on addressing this complex problem. We know from the research that a lot of disinformation comes from the top down. It comes from political elites, and we've discussed some of that during this session, and also not to let legacy media off the hook, because it can also circulate both on social media and on mainstream media. But my question is more about historic memory going back to 1983, and no one yet has mentioned how we've already had a test run in a very different media environment of truth in political advertising laws at the federal level, which lasted for no more than 12 months and was repealed under the Hawke-Keating government. So my question is that in this more complex, and I call it something beyond a media environment, but an information ecosystem, as has been pointed out on the panel, we get information from all sources, well beyond traditional newspapers, radio and television, but also on social media. If the laws were gamed at that point by politicians, then why do we feel so optimistic that the same thing won't happen again now? And what sort of resources would be needed for a federal electoral commission to possibly deal with the avalanche or the fire hydrant of distortions that might be coming and being gained by the politicians? I'll aim this question at Lisa, because she's written about this question for many years.
Thank you. Lisa.
Well, first of all, anyone that's interested in reading about the history of these experiments, and we do talk about the history of that experiment in our book, it's free online. I had to pay the publisher to make it free online, so knock yourselves out and download it for free. But the question, Andrew, and probably you know, this is a question that you could answer too, I guess, because you are Professor of Communications. But what's to stop politicians from gaming it? Nothing. But occasionally politicians do introduce laws like this. It happened in South Australia and it hasn't been repealed. If they can trip and introduce them, it's going to be very hard for them to untrip themselves. But first they've got to trip to do it. But there is a bill before the Parliament right now, federally. And I mean, what do you think the gaming will be there? What are you worried about?
No rhetorical questions. So that's,
No, it's not a rhetorical question. It's an actual question.
Sure. We've moved the mic along. Can you hand the mic back, please? And we'll get a question. We'll get a quick to and fro.
So what do you mean there? It's actually been put towards the Parliament. It's at the second reading stage now. It may have even gone through the second reading stage. I think it has.
Well, first of all, it hasn't been passed.
No, that's right.
The second point,
And it's not the and there were two bills by Zali Steggall before that, almost identical.
and the second point would be that it lasted only 12 months in the 1980s in a much more simple media environment. Electoral Commission's main purpose is to run elections. If they are given this secondary function, which has proven to work at, as you say, the sub-jurisdictional level of South Australian ACT, but the federal level is a much bigger jurisdiction than that, and there's many people, including elites, that have self-gain from being able to manufacture misinformation and disinformation, and I just wonder if that would overwhelm the Australian Electoral Commission to have the resource to be able to tackle that in a timely manner, which is 33 days being the duration of a campaign.
Exactly.
I've always wanted to do this to Cass, so I was just about to do that. She used to do it to me when she worked as one of my producers a million years ago. Very briefly.
In that legislation, and that was one of our concerns, that would overwhelm the commissions are supposed to be running elections, and Mick Sherry hasn't minded it and he's been fine with it. Most commissioners probably aren't that happy with it. But within this legislation, there's an electoral communications panel that's kind of embedded next to electoral commissions, but not electoral commission staff. And there's between 3 and 14 of them. And the person who's going to be the chair of it would be a retired federal court judge. So within that legislation, it's already been set aside that it wouldn't be overburdening the commission. Other people would be doing it. But in the initial stages, they'd be getting advice from the Electoral Commission. But I think it's very mindful of that it doesn't want, we don't want to overburden the Electoral Commissions. Elections are even harder to run than they ever were before. But remember, when you said it was a simpler time, first time it was dropped, it was a less scary time.
Yeah.
That's why. And people say, oh, I don't know, it's a bit of let's get rid of it. Nobody paid much attention when it was introduced, and nobody paid much attention in getting rid of it. But now it's a much scarier environment. But thanks for those questions, Andrew.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Anka Sahin, I'm an immigration law professional and political commentator. I'm just going to pick up on something that you said, Jon, and my question will be for Yee-Fi. You talked about trust deficit, and various panelists have touched upon how electoral participation rates have been falling right across the globe, and I think you mentioned it too. And despite the fact that we have compulsory voting in Australia, we've seen the same trend here. We've seen an increase in informal voting. We've seen also the percentage share of the vote that the 2.5 majors get election after election also decreasing consistently. So trust in government is at an all-time low. So it's no surprise that, that there was significant backlash against the proposed misinformation and disinformation bill when a government-appointed body was supposedly going to be made the arbiter of the truth.
And your question?
My question to Yee-Fi is, I know your research has been mostly around South Australia, and there's about 3 decades of experience in electoral truth and electoral advertising that can be gleaned from there. But do you think that, given that it's a much smaller electorate, much smaller jurisdiction, what lessons do you think will be directly transferable to the federal level, okay, and what lessons, what will need to be differently done at the federal level to account for that trust deficit? Okay,
thank you. And the next question I want right up at the very, very back, if someone can get a microphone to the woman who's waving her hand up there. And I am trying to get to everybody, but I just need to get a microphone right up to the back while Yee-Fi answers that gentleman's question. How can you translate the South Australia experience when it's in such a small jurisdiction?
Yeah, sure. So what we see from South Australia is that we've got a narrow law that can be administered, and that can be translated to various other jurisdictions. What is necessary is the resourcing issue. So to resource the regulator, whether it's the Electoral Commission or some other panel appropriately, to be able to enforce the laws in a timely manner. Because what we see is quite a time-limited electoral campaign, like 4 to 6 weeks. And it's very important that any lies or misleading ads are dealt with very quickly. And that can only be done if the regulator is appropriately resourced and supported to respond very quickly. So I think that these laws can be transferable to larger jurisdictions. I've spoken to people who've run political ads all over the country, including South Australia, and they say that the ads that they run in South Australia are no different from the other jurisdictions. So they are still vicious and still attack ads. Sorry, Lisa. But so there's still some level of, political aggression and campaigning that goes on in South Australia. It's not exempt from that. But what we see is the worst of the lies are weeded out, and that the political parties are extremely careful in crafting the ads. So I think it is a transplantable model, but obviously we have to scale up if we go federal.
I mean, it would change the culture, so then the volume would over time, very quickly be reduced anyway. At first to be a huge workload, and then it wouldn't, because parties start doing the policing of each other.
I've got a woman at the very back and a gentleman at the front. I'm going to ask you to ask your questions one after the other, and then I'm going to give the panel the last word because we're pretty much out of time. Go ahead.
My question's to Professor Lisa Hill. My name's Julia Thornton. I'm from Accountability Roundtable. My question goes to the definition of political, particularly as it affects what you were calling the narrow electoral disinformation problem. I was reading a couple of weeks ago a really interesting article in Politico that was talking about the Joe Rogan interview. And the point of the article was to suggest that that forum, at least on the face of it, what the part that got televised was actually pretty non-political. It was a bro talk amongst bros, kind of discussing bro things in a fairly non-political way. But the second point that the article made was that the politics didn't exist in that visible forum. Where it existed was in the way that that audience was then fed into an ecosystem of advertising and other kind of leads into conservative thinking as they expressed more and more interest in the bro culture. So it was a kind of politics by stealth method of capturing people. I'm really unsure about how that could be regulated as part of third-party advertising.
It's a great point. Okay, thank you. And gentlemen down the front here, and then I'll ask each of the panel to sum up.
Ian Muldoon, retired Air Force officer, retired high school teacher, retired adjudicator, and now I'm writing about music. And my question is addressed to Miss Milligan. And I was very taken by her opening remarks, actually. When I was in high school, I noticed that there were many students when they got to year 12 couldn't tell me the 3 levels of government. The only compulsory subject in New South Wales education system is English, and rightly so. But is there a case to be made, and I believe it should be made, that civics, what is the common good, what is compulsory voting, et cetera, why do we have a defence force and so on and so forth, an amazing range of issues could be covered under that rubric. Whereas at the moment, civics is an addendum to social science and may be taught or may not.
Okay.
Have you got any views about that?
Louise?
Yeah, I have strong views about that. I think it should definitely be a compulsory subject in high school. I mean, I did politics up until year 12, like not civics, but just politics. I think that should be compulsory, frankly. And you know what? It's not even not compulsory. It's not even offered. Like at a lot of very prestigious schools, government and non-government, they don't offer politics as a subject, which astonishes me. And yeah, I think that's something that's okay to express my opinion about. I feel really, really strongly about that. Because we would get probably better governments if, and I'm, not talking about particular governments, but we would get better governments if we had a better informed electorate. So yeah, I feel really, really strongly about that.
And Lisa, a question to you about the definition of what's political when you're doing just general chat.
Well, what you were talking about is a more subtle, diffuse political conditioning that would not come under this. So that's on the train that got derailed, the mis and disinformation possibly, but probably not. Probably that wouldn't even get on that train. And there's not a lot we can do about that except to kind of insulate people and educate people so they can tell the difference between when they're being manipulated or being lied to or being sucked into something. This legislation on the train that's still not derailed, that's still in at the second reading stage, will just cover a very, very narrow class of speech, which is authorised speech by identifiable political actors. So it is political is defined as a message designed to win an electoral advantage. That's how it's defined. Now, in South Australia, it's actually interpreted far more broadly. It's any communication that might, by an identifiable actor that might affect somebody's electoral choice. And I prefer that myself. It's harder to regulate, but Mick Sherry will just prosecute it all year round. If somebody says something that's likely to affect someone's choice a year from now, he will prosecute it. Whereas the federal legislation on the table now is much, much narrower.
And Yee-Fi, final word?
So disinformation and misinformation is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and more political actors or NGOs or the UN or a whole lot of people are starting to focus on this issue. I think we're only at the beginning of the debate of how we might regulate it. So truth in political advertising is a very small slice or sliver of what we need to look at. I think we do need to look at social media platforms more generally if we want to combat broader disinformation in our society. And yeah, we need to try to get through despite the vested interests that might try to impede such regulation.
We're out of time, and it's a brave man who stands between an audience and their dinner, and I'm not that brave. I think it's fabulous that everyone's paid such concentrated attention to three experts in their field, and your questions show how switched on everybody is. A very quick anecdote, along with Michael and maybe some other people in this room, I was an election observer in East Timor in their last national election. They do it better than us. People weep as they vote. Blood has been shed in living memory over that democracy. It was unbelievably moving. But not just at the time of casting the vote. At the time of counting the vote, the whole village comes out to watch. Every vote is held up for people to see, one by one. They're small villages, but the process, even in the cities, it's the same. It's totally open for scrutiny. People are active participants. And I think it was Harry Truman who said it's the duty of every citizen who cares about democracy to be a part-time politician. Otherwise, we're not part of what's happening. We're letting it fall into disrepair, to go back to where we were. Could you thank our three experts who have been fantastic? And may your deliberations tomorrow build even further on this. Tom, thank you for putting this on. It's been great fun. Have a good evening. Good night.